Men, women, and children sobbed as they were forced to board the steamship. They looked back at their homeland, never knowing if they'd see it again. The steamship was small, cramped, and creaky as around 700 innocent Muscogee people stepped aboard. It was a cold, rainy October night, and for some, it would be their last. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. First of all, thank you to our YouTube members for picking this episode. Secondly, this one is going to be different than a typical Shipwreck Sunday episode. We have a multi-ship disaster that happened in the 1830s, so information on each ship will be a bit spotty. However, we do know what happened with the disaster itself, which is the most important part. Before we get into the disaster, let's look at one of the biggest tragedies in human rights to have ever existed, the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was signed into law on May 28, 1830 by President Andrew Jackson. According to Congress, the law provided, quote, for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories, and for their removal west of the river Mississippi. Essentially, this was one of the laws that forced Native Americans from their homes. During Andrew Jackson's presidency from 1829 to 1837, and Martin Van Buren's presidency from 1837 to 1841, more than 60,000 Native Americans from at least 18 tribes were forced to move from their homes and move west of the Mississippi River, being allocated to new lands. Most of the southern tribes were moved to what was called the Indian Territory and is now Oklahoma, and the northern tribes were initially relocated to Kansas. With very few exceptions, most of the United States east of the Mississippi and the Great Lakes area was emptied of its Native American population. This movement was riddled with an enormous number of deaths, disease, and hardships during the journey, as well as being forced from their sacred land. Some tribes, namely the Cherokee, challenged their relocation in U.S. courts, but they were unsuccessful. The Cherokee were forced west in a march that later became known as the Trail of Tears. Since the dawn of the 21st century, scholars have rightfully cited the act and subsequent removals as an early example of state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing or genocide or settler colonialism, or a combination of all three. What we can name it is vile and an absolute violation of the rights as human beings. I personally was never taught about the Trail of Tears or about the Indian Removal Act further than the name, and that is a failure of the school system where I grew up. This ethnic cleansing was the groundwork of the Steamboat Monmouth Disaster. The Muscogee, also known as Muscogee Creek or just Creek, are a group of related indigenous peoples of the southeastern woodlands in the United States. Their historical homelands are in what is now part of southern Tennessee, most of Alabama, western Georgia, and parts of northern Florida. Most of them were forcibly removed from their territory to Oklahoma in the 1830s during the Trail of Tears, though a small group of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy remained in Alabama, and their descendants formed the federally recognized Porch Band of Creek Indians. The Muscogee have a vast, fascinating history, but we are going to be focusing on their relocation to Oklahoma, unfortunately. The Alabama Immigrating Company, through the agency of Colonel W.A. Campbell, essentially a small section of the U.S. Army, hired 3 steamboats at New Orleans, Louisiana, to move the Upper Creeks band of Muscogee Native Americans to the Great Plains, mostly in Oklahoma. The 3 ships were the Yazoo, the John Newton, and the Monmouth. All 3 of them are paddle-wheel steamships, though unfortunately I only have specs on the Monmouth, which was 135 tons. Another comparable steamship from that time is the New York, built in 1837. She doesn't have anything to do with the story, but based upon her specs, we can at least have some context for the size of the other ships we are working with here. New York's tonnage weighed in at 365 tons, and she was about 160.5 feet long and had a beam of about 22.5 feet wide. The 3 steamships in our story today are not the size of Titanic, but they don't need to be for devastation to ensue. These steamships are not massive, but the love of our YouTube members and patrons is. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright, time to get into the disaster. On or about the night of October 31st, 1837, roughly 700 Muscogee passengers were loaded onto the Monmouth, which was very cramped and beyond capacity at this point. Not only was it overloaded, but it was crewed negligently. Don't worry, we'll get there and I'll explain. It was a cold, rainy night on the Mississippi as the ship headed out from New Orleans to the Arkansas River. As she neared Prophet Island, as in the religious figure, now called Prophet Island as in a financial gain, another steamer was in the midst. Another steamship called Warren was nearby, and behind her was a sailboat called Trenton or Tremont. Sources differ. Warrant was towing the ship, and for simplicity's sake, we'll just call her Tremont. According to Cecil Mears, the owner of the Monmouth, a man named Mr. Eastman, was standing on the bridge at the time of the accident. He recalled hearing the piercing sound of a bell ring out into the night, and he asked the pilot why he'd done so. To that, the pilot shouted, "Don't you see it?" And Eastman had just enough time to look as the Tremont slammed into the Monmouth. According to most researchers, Monmouth was in the wrong, violating traditional navigation rules of the river and veering unexpectedly into the path of the Warren. While trying to avoid a collision, the Warren turned away, and the Tremont swung into the Monmouth. The force of the collision split the Monmouth open like a melon, and the Mississippi River flooded in. According to a contemporary source, quote, "The hull sank and the cabin floated downstream in two parts." Screams rang out into the skies as the ship sank quickly down to the bottom of the Mississippi River. The Monmouth took the ship's fireman, the ship's barkeeper, and an estimated 311 Native Americans with her. Mr. Eastman, though not a very reliable source, was vehement in denying rumors that the ship was old, rotten, or unseaworthy, or the fact that she was in a part of the river she should not have been. He did go on to say that the rain and darkness combined with the neglect of Warren's officers were to be at fault, since they did not put lights on the Tremont. This was not confirmed by newspapers, however. He also said that there were 693 passengers aboard total, and that the loss of life was only 230, with, quote, "many of the survivors badly injured." I don't know what to believe here, so I'm going to go with most researchers' estimate of 311 deaths. The survivors were picked up by the Yazoo, the John Newton, and the Warren, being escorted to their intended destination for relocation. The bodies of the Muscogee who died that night were buried in mass graves near Port Allen, Louisiana. Reportedly, the Monmouth might have only been a year old, launched sometime around 1836, though we don't have any records to confirm this either. The owner may have been telling the truth, but we'll never know for certain. What we do know is there are two sides to every story, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. Still, the loss of life in the Steamboat Monmouth disaster was the worst transportation disaster on the Mississippi River until the American Civil War, and the lives lost here added to the overall death toll of the Trail of Tears. I'm going to read to you a statement from Dave Barnett, a Muscogee who was there that night and gave one of the oral histories from the WPA Indian Pioneer History Project that was recorded in the 1930s, and he stated the following, quote, "When we boarded the ship, it was at nighttime and it was raining, cloudy and dark. There were dangerous waves of water. The people aboard the ship did not want the ship to start on the journey at night, but to wait until the next day. The men in command of the ship disregarded all suggestions and said, 'The ship is going tonight.' The ship was the kind that had an upper and lower deck. There were great stacks of boxes which contained whiskey and bottles. The officers in charge of the ship became intoxicated and even induced some of the Indians to drink. This created an uproar and turmoil. Timothy Barnett, who was my father, and I begged the officers to stop the ship until morning, as the men in charge of the steering of the ship could not control the ship and keep it on its course, but was causing it to go around and around. We saw a night ship coming down the stream. We could distinguish these ships as they had lights. Many of those on board our ship tried to tell the officers to give the command to stay to one side so that the ship could pass on by. It was then that it seemed that the ship was just turned loose because it was taking a zigzag course in the water until it rammed right into the center of the night boat. Then there was the screaming of the children, men, women, mothers, and fathers when the ship began to sink. Everyone on the lower deck that could was urged to go up on the upper deck until some of the smaller boats could come to the rescue. The smaller boats were called by signal, and they came soon enough, but the lower deck had been hit so hard it was broken in two and was rapidly sinking, and a great many of the Indians were drowned. Rest in peace to him and all of the other survivors and victims of this great tragedy. The relocation to a new home was tragedy enough, let alone for so many to perish in such a horrific, violent death. This story has broken my heart and made me so enraged for what happened to them. May we learn from this and not allow history to ever repeat itself. How did this happen? According to author Louis C. Hunter in his book Steamboats of the Western River, river navigation was perilous and difficult. With the Mississippi River being so wide, you'd think that ships would easily be able to avoid each other. However, sandbars, island chutes, rapids, and low water areas hinder navigation and narrow the river in certain spots. Navigation is only more difficult when ships had flat bottoms and little to no keel to grip the water. Boats going upriver had to follow different routes than those going down, though when faced with the decision of which course to follow, captains would often place their ships unknowingly into the path of another. Maneuvering a steamship in stormy weather at night in currents with some bad luck sprinkled on top just made a recipe for disaster for the Monmouth. Warning lights were not the norm on steamships at this point in time, either, and agreed-upon regulations for lights or bell and whistle signals were not in place until more tragedies urged the need for it. It took until 1875 for searchlights to be introduced to riverboats and the final quarter of the 19th century for the local government to put markers, buoys, and signal lights in place. It took until 1885 for the government to begin setting up a system of forecasting river conditions, instead of word of mouth being the main source of information for pilots. Around this time, the U.S. Corps of Engineers began creating river charts and river forecasts that are invaluable to this day, despite the fact that the river will never fully be tamed. We can safely say that poor navigational practices on all fronts, poor regulations in general, and the overcrowding of the Monmouth greatly contributed to this disaster and allowed it to become the massive loss of life that it was. Her wreckage, or what is left of it, lies at roughly 30.5910 degrees north and 91.2948 degrees west within the Mississippi River, just north of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The relocation of Native Americans and the Trail of Tears was a disgusting, shameful period of time in American history, and the Monmouth is a small snapshot of this, resulting in the deaths of so many innocent Muscogee people that were forcibly removed from their sacred lands. Rest in peace to the victims and survivors. I hope they have found peace in the afterlife. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Mississippi River ships playlist in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of MV Princess Victoria, a ro-ro ferry that sank in the North Channel in 1953. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.